All right, 9:40 on this Friday morning. I think more and more people are beginning to recognize the threat posed by climate change. You're going to be hearing a lot about it in the next week. Earth Day is next week, and that's when we start to talk a lot about climate restoration. Our next guest has written a book about it, along with Carol Douglas. This grew from a white paper that they authored, and the book is called Climate Restoration. Peter Fiekowsky on the line with us right now. Peter, good morning.
Good morning. Good to be with you.
And I appreciate you joining us this morning. What do you mean by climate restoration? Let's just start there with kind of an explanation of what that means.
Well, climate restoration can be looked at as good news on the climate, where good news means getting what you want. So climate restoration means getting what we want on the climate, which is restoring it back to what it was 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, while we developed agriculture and civilization.
That's a tall order, though, isn't it?
It's a tall order, yes. That is, it's like building anything. Building a house, you have to decide what you want, and then it sort of comes together. You build it, but if you don't know what you want, it never happens. And it seems much more difficult than it actually is because we haven't actually asked for what we wanted. The current climate action is about avoiding what we don't want. So, don't get cold. Well, that doesn't build your house, but we store CO2 to levels that they were until 100 years ago. We actually know how to do that. And it turns out when you name what you want, it looks like it'll cost maybe $2 billion a year. So that 1/1000th of what we're already spending to do our energy transition, which is, of course, very important.
Well, that doesn't sound too bad at all. How do we do it? What's the best game plan, and over how many years to restore the climate?
Well, the target that we talk about is getting CO2 back to pre-industrial levels by 2050. So in 27 years. And we could do it faster if we wanted to. We picked that number because it just was poetic. And the way we do it, it turns out that nature has done it. So, if you know geologic history, you've heard of ice ages, and our planet has gone through ice ages every 100,000 years for a million years or so. When in the process of cooling down for an ice age, the nature takes out 1 trillion tons of CO2 from the atmosphere. And that's the same amount of CO2, roughly, that we put in the atmosphere during the burning our coal and oil and so on. And so then the question is, how do we duplicate what nature has done as recently as 20,000 years ago? And that turns out to be very doable. Nature has two approaches to getting massive amounts of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. The main one it uses during the ice ages is photosynthesis. So most of us know that trees capture CO2 from the air and store it in their wood. In the ocean, it's algae, which makes the ocean green. And when algae dies, it either gets eaten or it sinks. And if it gets eaten, then when the fish die, they sink. And when it sinks in the ocean, there's very little oxygen in the deep water, and so it doesn't rot. And that's the difference with trees. That we all know that when trees die, they rot or sometimes catch fire. But in the ocean, which is 3/4 of the planet's surface, there's lots of sunlight, lots of water, lots of nutrients, and so it's a great place for photosynthesis to capture CO2. And the gating item, what limits it, pardon me for being an engineer.
No, that's okay. Yeah.
The limiting factor in most of the ocean is iron, because iron is not very soluble and it sinks. But as you know, iron is necessary for life and it's necessary for photosynthesis. Normally, it's dust storms and volcanic dust which provides iron across the ocean. but also historically it was whales would eat a lot of iron-rich food from deep in the ocean, and they poop it near the surface, and again bringing the iron back to the surface. And we killed off 98% of the whales in the last century back before oil, so we were using whale oil. And the result is that we can bring the iron back. This was just discovered in 1990. It's very difficult to discover, but because it takes incredibly small amounts of iron, nature got very smart about how to make good use of the iron. And it turned out that there was a test done about 10 years ago, and they distributed iron dust in an eddy in the Gulf of Alaska, and it produced it sequestered a whole lot of carbon from the photosynthesis and produced a boom in salmon. Some of us here I'm on the West Coast in California. 2 years later, in 2014, a lot of us still remember buying salmon for $1 a pound and wondering, why is salmon so cheap?
Right.
Well, it's because they did this test which produced the algae, which was food for the salmon. There was a huge salmon harvest. So the point there is the salmon harvest more than paid for the cost of actually distributing the dust. So that's why it's very inexpensive. And so the limiting factor for us now is the will. And that's why I wrote the book.
That's exactly what I was going to ask about next, is how do we get everybody around the world on the same page on this? Because it's hard to get everybody around the world on the same page on anything.
That's a good question. You know, in my own experience, the first step was for me to discover that I was totally resigned about the climate, and that it's like we are so messed up, we are so screwed. Once I accepted that, oh my God, no one knows what they're doing. I'm a MIT educated physicist with 27 patents and a Silicon Valley business. A fairly smart guy. And it's like, my God, no one is doing the obvious that we have to get the carbon back out of the atmosphere. Once I discovered I was resigned and accepted that I was resigned, then I could say, okay, good. Let's do something new. So what people can do is notice your fear and resignation, and then share with people that you and we are all committed to restoring the climate. And there are people, of course, who believe it can't be done. There are people who believe everything can't be done. But the only way to fail is to not try. Yeah. And as I said, the good news is if you look in geological history, nature has done it without even trying, right? Nature just throws dust around and things happen. We know how to do it optimally. But using the ocean, there are other techniques also based on what nature does over longer periods. But using the ocean, it takes all of 1% of the ocean surface. That's how much sunlight there is. It's not that much work to do it.
Very interesting. We're talking with Peter Fiekowsky. His book is Climate Restoration: The Only Future That Will Sustain the Human Race. Finally, Peter, what can I do just in my everyday life? What can we all do to help restore the climate?
Well, the most important thing is out of my experience doing citizen advocacy, share about it, write letters to the editor so other people are thinking about it. It's always good to do things, plan on getting an electric car. In the book, I talked about how the global population is now 10 times the very stable level it was. Encourage young people to have few kids. Again, the population is 10 times what the planet was used to for millions of years. And so we will want to have small families for a while to get back to that so we're not decimating nature. All of those things send a message to everybody that we are planning on a future where humanity flourishes.
Really interesting stuff. Do you have a website or somewhere where we can find out more? Obviously, you've got the book. Where can we learn more?
Yeah, my two websites. One is mine, peterfiekowsky.com, and you can read about the book there and get links to order it. And the Foundation for Climate Restoration.org. The short is F and the number 4 CR, Foundation for Climate Restoration.org, and they have local groups. So across the country and across the world, you can join people who are meeting with their civic leaders, mayors and members of Congress, because there is legislation that can really accelerate the move. The most important, though, is to talk about it. So peterfiekowsky.com and foundationforclimaterestoration.org.
All right. Glad we were able to talk about it this morning. Peter, thanks for your time. Appreciate it very much.
Oh, thank you very much. This is just a pleasure.